Such are the chief features in the wretched business. Even the blue books in their dry recital arouse in the reader painful and indignant emotions. But meanwhile other and still more stirring events were passing outside the world of paper and ink. The arrival of Gordon at Khartoum had seriously perplexed and alarmed Mohammed Ahmed and his caliphs. Their following was discouraged, and they themselves feared lest the general should be the herald of armies. His Berber proclamation reassured them, and as the weeks passed without reinforcements arriving, the Mahdi and Abdullah, with that courage which in several great emergencies drew them to the boldest courses, determined to put a brave face on the matter and blockade Khartoum itself. They were assisted in this enterprise by a revival of the patriotic impulse throughout the country and a consequent stimulus to the revolt. To discover the cause it is necessary to look to the eastern Sudan, where the next tragedy, after the defeat of Hicks, is laid. The Hadendoa tribe, infuriated by oppression and misgovernment, had joined the rebellion under the leadership of the celebrated, and perhaps immortal, Osman Digna. The Egyptian garrisons of Tokar and Sinkat were beleaguered and hard-pressed. Her Majesty's government disclaimed all responsibility. Yet, since these towns were not far from the coast, they did not prohibit an attempt on the part of the Egyptian government to rescue the besieged soldiers. Accordingly, an Egyptian force 3,500 strong marched from Suakin in February 1884 to relieve Tokar, under the command of General Baker, once the gallant colonel of the 10th Hussars. Hard by the wells of Teb they were, on the 5th of February, attacked by about 1,000 Arabs. On the square being only threatened by a small force of the enemy, the Egyptian troops threw down their arms and ran, carrying away the black troops with them, and allowing themselves to be killed without the slightest resistance. General Baker to Sir E. Baring, February 6, or official despatch, telegraphic. The British and European officers in vain endeavored to rally them. The single Sudanese battalion fired impartially on friend and foe. The general, with that unshaken courage and high military skill which had already on the Danube gained him a continental reputation, collected some 1,500 men, mostly unarmed, and so returned to Suakin. 96 officers and 2,250 men were killed. Krupp guns, machine guns, rifles, and a large supply of ammunition fell to the victorious Arabs. Success inflamed their ardor to the point of madness. The attack of the towns was pressed with redoubled vigor. The garrison of Sinkat, 800 strong, sallied out and attempted to fight their way to Suakin. The garrison of Tokar surrendered. Both were destroyed. The evil was done. The slaughter was complete. Yet the British government resolved to add to it. The garrisons they had refused to rescue they now determined to avenge. In spite of their philanthropic professions, and in spite of the advice of General Gordon, who felt that his position at Khartoum would be still further compromised by operations on his only line of retreat, Sir E. Baring to Earl Granville, Cairo, February 23. A considerable military expedition consisting of 1 cavalry and 2 infantry brigades was sent to Suakin. The command was entrusted to General Graham. Troops were hurriedly concentrated. The 10th Hussars, returning from India, were stopped and mounted on the horses of the gendarmerie. With admirable celerity the force took the field. Within a month of the defeat at Teb, they engaged the enemy almost on the very scene of the disaster. On the 4th of March they slew 3,000 Hadendoa, and drove the rest in disorder from the ground. 4 weeks later a second action was fought at Tamai. Again the success of the British troops was complete. Again the slaughter of the Arabs was enormous. But neither victory was bloodless. El Teb cost 24 officers and 168 men, Tamai, 13 officers and 208 men. The effect of these operations was the dispersal of Osman Digna's gathering. That astute man, not for the first or last time, made a good retreat. 10,000 men, had thus been killed in the space of 3 months in the eastern Sudan. By the discipline of their armies the government were triumphant. The tribes of the Red Seashore cowered before them. But as they fought without reason, so they conquered without profit. As soon as Gordon had been finally refused the assistance of Zubair Pasha, it was evident that the rescue of the garrisons was impossible. The general had been sent as the last hope. Rightly or wrongly, his recommendations were ignored. His mission was an admitted failure. After that, the only question was how to bring him away as quickly as possible. It was certain that he would not come willingly. Force was necessary. Yet it was difficult to know how to apply it. After the victories in the eastern Sudan, the opportunity presented itself. The road was open. The local tribes were crushed. Berber had not then fallen. The Mahdi was himself still on the road from El Obeid to Khartoum. Sir Evelyn Baring saw the chance. He did not then occupy the formidable and imposing position in Egyptian politics that he has since attained. But with all his influence, he urged the dispatch of a small flying column to Khartoum. His idea was simple. 1,000 or 1,200 men were to mount on camels and ride thither via Berber. Those who fell ill or whose camels broke down would have to take their chance by the roadside. The plan, however, broke down in the military detail. Only one honorable course remained: a regular expedition. This the British agent at once began to urge. This the government obstinately refused to admit, and meanwhile time was passing. The situation at Khartoum became grave even before the breach between General Gordon and Mr. Gladstone's cabinet was complete. While the British government was indulging in vengeful operations in the eastern Sudan, the Mahdi advanced slowly but steadily upon the town, with a following variously estimated at from 15 to 20,000 men. On the 7th of March, Colonel Stewart telegraphed from Khartoum, "The Mahdi has attempted to raise the people of Shindi by an emissary. We may be cut off, Lieutenant Colonel Stewart to Sir E. Baring, March 7, 1884, and on the 11th Gordon himself reported, "The rebels are 4 hours distant on the Blue Nile." Major General Gordon to Sir E. Baring, March 11, 1884. Thereafter no more telegrams came, for on the 15th the wire was cut between Shindi and Berber, and the blockade had commenced. The long and glorious defense of the town of Khartoum will always fascinate attention. That one man, a European among Africans, a Christian among Mohammedans, should by his genius have inspired the efforts of 7,000 soldiers of inferior race, and by his courage have sustained the hearts of 30,000 inhabitants of notorious timidity, and with such materials and encumbrances have offered a vigorous resistance to the increasing attacks of an enemy who, though cruel, would yet accept surrender, during a period of 317 days, is an event perhaps without parallel in history. But it may safely be predicted that no one will ever write an account which will compare in interest, or in detail, with that set forth by the man himself in the famous Journals at Khartoum. The brief account has delighted thousands of readers in Europe and America. Perhaps it is because he is careless of the sympathy of men that Charles Gordon so readily wins it. Before the first of the 6 parts into which the journals were divided is finished, the reader has been won. Henceforth he sees the world through Gordon's eyes. With him he scoffs at the diplomatists, despises the government, becomes impatient unreasonably, perhaps with a certain Major Kitchener in the intelligence branch, whose information miscarried, or was not dispatched, is wearied by the impracticable Shaija irregulars, takes interest in the turkey cock and his harem of 4 wives, laughs at the black sluts seeing their faces for the first time in the mirror. With him he trembles for the fate of the poor little beast, the Husseinier, when she drifts stern foremost on the shoal, a penny steamer under cannon fire. Day after day he gazes through the general's powerful telescope. From the palace roof down the long brown reaches of the river towards the rocks of the Shabluka Gorge, and longs for some sign of the relieving steamers, and when the end of the account is reached, no man of British birth can read the last words. Now mark this. If the expeditionary force and I ask for no more than 200 men does not come within 10 days, the town may fall. And I have done my best for the honor of our country. Goodbye, without being thrilled with vain regrets and futile resolutions. And then the account stops short. Nor will the silence ever be broken. The 6th installment of the journals was dispatched on the 14th of December, and when it is finished the reader, separated suddenly from the pleasant companionship, experiences a feeling of loss and annoyance. Imagination, long supported, is brushed aside by stern reality. Henceforward Gordon's perils were unrecorded. I would select one episode only from the journals as an example of the peculiarity and the sternness of Charles Gordon's character, his behavior towards Slatin. This Austrian officer had been governor of Darfur with the rank in the Egyptian service of Bey. For 4 years he had struggled vainly against the rebellion. He had fought numerous engagements with varied success. He had been several times wounded. Throughout his province and even beyond its limits, he bore the reputation of a brave and capable soldier. The story of his life of suffering and adventure, written by himself, is widely known, and he is thought by those who have read it to be a man of feeling and of honor. By those who enjoy his personal acquaintance, this belief is unhesitatingly confirmed. He had, however, committed an act which deprived him of Gordon's sympathy and respect. During the fighting in Darfur, after several defeats, his Mohammedan soldiers were discouraged and attributed their evil fortune to the fact that their commander was an infidel under the curse of the Almighty. Slatin therefore proclaimed himself a follower of the Prophet, and outwardly at least adopted the faith of Islam. The troops, delighted at his conversion and cheered by the hope of success, renewed their efforts, and the resistance of the governor of Darfur was prolonged. The end, however, was deferred, not averted. After the destruction of General Hicks's army, Slatin was compelled to surrender to the dervishes. The religion he had assumed to secure victory, he observed to escape death. The Arab leaders, who admired his courage, treated him at first with respect and kindness, and he was conducted to the Mahdi in his encampment before Khartoum. There during the siege he remained, closely watched but not imprisoned. Thence he wrote letters to Gordon explaining his surrender, excusing his apostasy, and begging that he might be allowed, not even assisted, to escape to Khartoum. The letters are extant, and scarcely anyone who reads them, reflecting on the 12 years of danger and degradation that lay before this man, will refuse that compassion. Gordon was inflexible. Before the arrival of the letters his allusions to Slatin are contemptuous. One cannot help being amused at the Mahdi carrying all the Europeans about with him, nuns, priests, Greeks, Austrian officers, what a medley, a regular attack major. Journals at Khartoum. He is suspicious of the circumstances of his surrender. The Greek, says Slatin, had 4,000 ardebs of Dura, 1,500 cows, and plenty of ammunition. He has been given 8 horses by the Mahdi. He will not vouch for such a man, but he adds, with characteristic justice, all this information must be taken with reserve. At length the letters came. At the peril of his life, when ordered to write and demand the surrender of the town, Slatin substituted an appeal to Gordon to countenance his escape. This is the uncompromising minute in the journals, October 16th. The letters of Slatin have arrived. I have no remarks to make on them, and cannot make out why he wrote them. In the afternoon, indeed, he betrays some pity, but it is the pity of a man for a mouse. He is evidently not a Spartan, he will want some quarantine, one feels sorry for him. The next day he is again inexorable, and gives his reasons clearly. I shall have nothing to do with Slatin's coming here to stay, unless he has the Mahdi's positive leave, which he is not likely to get. His doing so would be the breaking of his parole, which should be as sacred when given to the Mahdi as to any other power, and it would jeopardize the safety of all these Europeans, prisoners with Mahdi. Slatin's position, it should be observed, was not that of an officer released on parole, but of a prisoner of war in durance in the enemy's camp. In such circumstances, he was clearly entitled to escape at his own proper risk. If his captors gave him the chance, they had only themselves to blame. His position was not dissimilar from that of the black soldiers, who had been captured by the dervishes, and were now made to serve against the government. These deserted to Khartoum daily, and the general fully acquiesced in their doing so. As to Slatin's escape affecting the treatment of the other European prisoners, it must be observed that when at various times escapes were effected from Omdurman, and ultimately when Slatin himself escaped, no ill treatment was inflicted on the rest of the prisoners, and even had such ill treatment been the certain consequence of an escape, that need not have debarred a man, according to the customs of war, from attempting to regain his liberty. Nothing but his free and formal promise, obtained in return for favors received, can alienate that right. If the Mahdi chose to slaughter the remaining prisoners, the responsibility rested with the Mahdi. Slatin was, however, in no position to argue his case. His correspondence with Gordon was discovered. For some days his life hung on a thread. For several months he was heavily chained and fed on a daily handful of uncooked durra, such as is given to horses and mules. Tidings of these things were carried to Gordon. Slatin, he observes icily, is still in chains. He never doubted the righteousness of the course he had adopted, never for an instant. But few will deny that there were strong arguments on both sides. Many will assert that they were nicely balanced. Gordon must have weighed them carefully. He never wavered. Yet he needed Slatin. He was alone. He had no one in whose military capacity he could put the slightest confidence. Again and again in the journals he expresses his want of trustworthy subordinates. He could not be everywhere, he said. Nearly every order has to be repeated 2 or 3 times. I am weary of my life. What one has felt so much? Here is the want of men like Jesse, or Mesadalia, or Slatin, but I have no one to whom I could entrust expeditions. This was the man who would have employed Zubair and bowed to expediency. But Zubair had never denied his lord. The actual defense of Khartoum is within the province of the journals, nor shall I attempt a chronological account. After the 10th of September, when General Gordon sent Colonel Stewart and Messrs. Power and Herbin down the river in the ill-fated Abbas steamer, he was altogether alone. Many men have bowed to the weight of responsibility. Gordon's responsibility was undivided. There was no one to whom he could talk as an equal. There was no one to whom he could ask to a trusty subordinate reveal his doubts. To some minds the exercise of power is pleasant, but few sensations are more painful than responsibility without control. The general could not supervise the defense. The officers robbed the soldiers of their rations. The sentries slumbered at their posts. The townspeople bewailed their misfortunes, and all ranks and classes intrigued with the enemy in the hope of securing safety when the town should fall. Frequent efforts were made to stir up the inhabitants, or sap their confidence. Spies of all kinds pervaded the town. The Egyptian pashas, despairing, meditated treason. Once an attempt was made to fire the magazine. Once no less than 80,000 ardebs of grain was stolen from the arsenal. From time to time the restless and ceaseless activity of the commander might discover some plot and arrest the conspirators, or, checking some account, might detect some robbery, but he was fully aware that what he found out was scarcely a tithe of what he could not hope to know. The Egyptian officers were untrustworthy. Yet he had to trust them. The inhabitants were thoroughly broken by war, and many were disloyal. He had to feed and inspirit them. The town itself was scarcely defensible. It must be defended to the end. From the flat roof of his palace his telescope commanded a view of the forts and lines. Here he would spend the greater part of each day, scrutinizing the defenses and the surrounding country with his powerful glass. When he observed that the sentries on the forts had left their posts, he would send over to have them flogged and their superiors punished. When his penny steamers engaged the dervish batteries he would watch, on tenterhooks, a combat which might be fatal to the defense, but which, since he could not direct it, must be left to officers by turns timid and reckless, and in the dark hours of the night he could not even watch. The journals, the only receptacle of his confidences, display the bitterness of his sufferings no less than the greatness of his character. There is no contagion, he writes, equal to that of fear. I have been rendered furious when from anxiety I could not eat. I would find those at the same table were in like manner affected. To the military anxieties was added every kind of worry which may weary a man's soul. The women clamored for bread. The townsfolk heaped reproaches upon him. The quarrel with the British government had cut him very deeply. The belief that he was abandoned and discredited, that history would make light of his efforts, would perhaps never know of them, filled his mind with a sense of wrong and injustice which preyed upon his spirits. The miseries of the townsfolk wrung his noble, generous heart. The utter loneliness depressed him. And over all lay the shadow of uncertainty. To the very end the possibility that all might be well mocked him with false hopes. The first light of any morning might reveal the longed-for steamers of relief and the uniforms of British soldiers. He was denied even the numbing anesthetic of despair. Yet he was sustained by two great moral and mental stimulants, his honor as a man, his faith as a Christian. The first had put all courses, which he did not think right once and for all out of the question, and so allayed many doubts and prevented many vain regrets. But the second was the real source of his strength. He was sure that beyond this hazardous existence, with all its wrongs and inequalities, another life awaited him, a life which, if he had been faithful and true here upon earth, would afford him greater faculties for good and wider opportunities for their use. Look at me now, he once said to a fellow traveler, with small armies to command and no cities to govern. I hope that death will set me free from pain, and that great armies will be given me, and that I shall have vast cities under my command. Lute, Colonel N. Newham Davis, Some Gordon Reminiscences, published in the Man of the World newspaper, December 14, 1898. Such was his bright hope of immortality. As the severity of military operations increases, so also must the sternness of discipline. The zeal of the soldiers, their warlike instincts, and the interests and excitements of war may ensure obedience of orders and the cheerful endurance of perils and hardships during a short and prosperous campaign. But when fortune is dubious or adverse, when retreats as well as advances are necessary, when supplies fail, arrangements miscarry, and disasters impend, and when the struggle is protracted, men can only be persuaded to accept evil things by the lively realization of the fact that greater terrors await their refusal. The ugly truth is revealed that fear is the foundation of obedience. It is certain that the influence of General Gordon upon the garrison and townspeople of Khartoum owed its greatest strength to that sinister element. It is quite painful, he writes in his journals in September, to see men tremble so, when they come and see me, that they cannot hold the match to their cigarette. Yet he employed all other methods of inspiring their efforts. As the winter drew on, the sufferings of the besieged increased and their faith in their commander and his promises of relief diminished. To preserve their hopes and, by their hopes, their courage and loyalty was beyond the power of man. But what a great man in the utmost exercise of his faculties and authority might do, Gordon did.